Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. My name is Nick Sobral. I'm a member of the Neuroscience Collaborative staff. We're glad you can join us for today's webinar, Collaborative Science in a Virtual World, Recognizing Limits and Leveraging Opportunities. The webinar today is part of our monthly webinar series that features research, integrated assessment, and science transfer projects funded by the Science Collaborative. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System, or NERRS, is a national network of 29 unique research reserves as shown on this map. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit. Each reserve site includes programs focused on land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. The Neuroscience Collaborative supports science for estuarine and coastal decision makers by coordinating regular funding opportunities and supporting user-driven collaborative research, assessment, and transfer activities that address critical coastal management needs identified by the reserves. The research it supports is highly collaborative, integrating end users into the research process to create products that support coastal management. All attendees were muted upon entry, and we will be handling questions via the question feature on the GoToWebinar console. We'll have time for questions during the Q&A segment at the end of the webinar. However, we encourage you to submit your questions as they occur to you throughout the webinar by entering them into the questions field on the webinar console. Given our goal of initiating an ongoing dialogue about today's topic, we have also set up a second mechanism for input during the webinar. In the chat box, we are going to share a Google document, which is called Gathering Input, where we encourage you to offer comments about two key questions: strategies and tips and additional needs and challenges related to virtual engagement for collaborative science. Providing your name and email address is optional, but it will allow us to follow up with additional questions if needed. So, the goal of today's session is to initiate what we hope will be an ongoing dialogue and joint learning about virtual engagement for collaborative science. Thank you so much to everyone who provided feedback via the registration questionnaire. We pinned a collection of these responses in the chat at the start of the webinar, and we'll also include them in a summary product we'll make available to all attendees as part of the webinar follow-up. Your perspectives were crucial to the development of this webinar and will also help guide ongoing science collaborative conversations around future joint learning exercises. Just a quick look here at just the depth and just the width of how much different expertise we have on the call with us today. This is a registration snapshot taken from earlier. You can see we have a huge spread of people from all regions represented in many different organization types, and it's just really good to see there's so much interest in this topic. So we hope that we can get to the core of a lot of your questions today as part of our discussions. So real quick before I pass it on to James here, we just wanted to run a quick poll question for all of you. So if you could please respond when you see the poll at your screen. We'll quickly share those poll results. Excellent, thank you. Looks we have a nice spread of different people, and remember, you are able to check all that applies. So it looks like we have a lot of different kind of roles that people have played in some of these projects, which is good. So this is helpful to have this kind of level of expertise on the call. So I will move on to introducing our moderator for today's session. James Arnott is the Executive Director of the Aspen Global Change Institute. James's research seeks to understand how to better link scientific knowledge with decision-making through research on collaborative science and science funding. He is also a visiting scholar at the University of Michigan's Graham Sustainability Institute and a member of the Neuroscience Collaborative team. James, I'll pass it to you now.
Thanks so much, Nick. Can you hear me loud and clear?
I went through loud and clear.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the introduction and setup, Nick, and thank all of you for joining today. It looks like we have 180 on the call right now. Good afternoon to everyone in the lower 48, and good morning to those that are joining from further west in Alaska, Hawaii, and other parts of the world. We just wanted to begin by recognizing that we're all joining this call about how we do virtual collaboration, coming at it with many very different experiences and how we've each been impacted by the current pandemic crisis. And we've all been doing a lot of learning, not only, I'm sure, all of us on how we do virtual collaboration better, but also how we do all aspects of our lives differently, whether it's homeschooling or haircuts or how we're adapting to some of the direct and real serious impacts of this crisis. So thank you for spending your time with us today. As alarming and serious as the current situation is, I also want to acknowledge what a kind of a fortunate outcome or a fortunate context that we, I think, are joined on this call today operate in, and that's this context of doing collaborative research. And I think we all have a really good sense of what that looks like and what collaborative research can achieve, different than some traditional approaches to doing research. But this is a figure that just tries to kind of articulate that the amount of opportunity for learning that can occur when you bring sponsors of research and researchers and users of research together in a more interactive model of doing research, and particularly when the goal is to try to improve outcomes in natural communities, ecosystems, or in human communities to build sustainability or to respond to different kinds of environmental impacts. And so it's kind of in this context of learning that we feel like there's a real big opportunity in this moment that we're living in the pandemic to experiment and learn and share with each other ideas about how we do collaborative research, not only in this urgent moment of social distancing, but also looking to the future, how we adapt our approaches of collaborative research to be the most effective and most efficient they can be with limited resources. And so that means asking kind of urgent questions that we have, today and for the next several months about how do we use all the different socially distanced tools that are available to us, whether they be video calls or webinars like we're doing right now, more interactive virtual workshops and conferences. When is it okay to just use a phone call or an email or use other socially distanced forms of communication? When should we, pick up a pen and paper and write a letter to someone? I sent a package to my staff before our staff meeting this week with a lot of different treats and pens and pencils and things that actually contributed to our virtual meeting. So when do we use those kinds of features as well? There's also an important question that remains, is that when we start to move past social distancing and we have these opportunities to come together face to face, to be in nice places and have retreats, or to meet for coffee or for happy hours, or to schedule field trips, when and how do we do those and select those approaches that are maybe particularly effective relative to virtual approaches after we've had this experience of this wide range of possibilities? And so this is kind of the premise for today's call. How can we start this conversation not only to answer the urgent questions of what we might be thinking about, how do we do virtual interaction better, but how do we think about this over the long run to evaluate where we might head when we have a wider range of options at our disposal? And we have a really terrific group of panelists joining the call today. And I'm going to introduce each one before they speak. But just in brief, we'll have Julia Wondolleck begin with kind of an overview of the fundamentals of collaboration. Then we'll hear some examples from practice doing this in a coastal context from Kristen Goodrich. And then we'll conclude with some real helpful best practices from Shannan Lewinski. But to get started, let's turn it over to Julia. And Dr. Julia Wondolleck is spent her career, over 30 years, studying the fundamentals of collaboration and what are the key ingredients that foster productive and meaningful collaborations. She is a professor at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. And with that, I'll hand it over to Julia.
Thanks, James, and good afternoon or good morning, or depending on where you are, to everyone. I just want to start by saying that I'm not an expert on virtual collaboration. Like all of you, I'm trying to do my best to adapt to this new temporary reality. However, as James mentioned, I have spent many years studying and learning from collaborative processes and management of natural resources and the environment. So I do have a good understanding of what makes collaboration work, what it is that enables effective collaboration. And I do think that that's the best place to start when talking about virtual collaboration. If we know what factors make it work in person, then we can ask the question, well, how do we make sure that these factors are present and strong when we collaborate virtually? I've written 2 books on this topic, and I just want to quickly give you the Cliff Notes version. I have a slide that's not, oh, here we go. Okay. I often use an analogy, bricks and mortar, to describe what makes collaboration work. Bricks are the tangible factors like MOUs and charters and decision rules and meeting agendas and advisory councils and working groups and the like. Mortar, in contrast, are the intangibles that hold the bricks together. These are the behaviors and motivations of the people involved. And you need both. You need both bricks and mortar. And I've listed some of the most critical factors here on the slide, starting with a brick, effective process, but mostly highlighting mortar, because I fear that is what is most tenuous in a virtual world. So what makes collaboration work? First, effective process, where the partners involved have clarity about its purpose and objectives, where there's clarity about the participant roles and responsibilities in that process. And things like that are often instilled through charters, through ground rules and the like. Effective process comes from meetings that are well managed with clear and purposeful agendas. It's time well spent, and where logistics are tended to. Relationships, mortar, matter hugely, both personal and professional relationships that facilitate easy communication, that foster commitment and a sense of obligation to one another and to the process, and that enable camaraderie, that make the process enjoyable for those involved in it. A sense of ownership of the process also fosters collaboration. Ownership comes from individual partners feeling that the process and the project is theirs. It isn't somebody else's meeting they're attending. It isn't somebody else's agenda. It's theirs. And there are numerous things you can do to foster that sense of ownership. Processes that add value, that are worthwhile, make collaboration work. It's not a waste of time that takes partners away from what they really should be doing, that they feel they should be spending their time on. The process, the project, the products make a difference to their work, to their community, and to the ecosystem that they care about. So it's a worthwhile process for them to engage in. A shared sense of purpose propels collaboration, a sense that we're in it together, we're a team, we all care about the same end goal. And finally, commitment to the process by those involved is essential. The partners are each motivated to ensuring it succeeds. They're not indifferent about it. And finally, commitment to the process by those involved is essential. The partners are each motivated to ensuring it succeeds. They're not indifferent. So these are the things that make collaboration work. The question for us this afternoon is twofold. First, what gets particularly threatened when all of the collaborative interaction occurs virtually? Which of these factors gets strained? Second, what are different ways to instill and sustain these qualities, these attributes of effective collaboration in a virtual world? These are the factors that you need to be attentive to, that you can't let languish. I also want to mention what we've learned about what sustains collaboration and sustains collaborative partnerships over time. Noted in your registration survey for this webinar that this was a question of particular, and a slide should pop up hopefully here. We did a study several years ago looking at 35 collaborative processes 5 years after we had first documented them. And we asked the question, what distinguishes the collaborative partnerships and processes that still existed from those that had faded away? And 4 factors stood out to us. The first factor, again, was commitment of those involved and their organizations. Those processes and partnerships that still existed evidence sustained commitment to the process. The people involved said that this is important, it matters to us, we want to see it succeed, and so they stuck with it. The second factor was continuity of the people involved and the purpose of the process or the partnership. The partnership's purpose didn't waver or become vague, and largely the same people were still involved. This means that transitions need to be carefully managed because transitions do occur. New issues arise. People change jobs, move, retire, lose interest. And the sustained partnerships had always had tended to manage those transitions in an effective way. The third factor was a compelling focus. And by that I mean that the process, objectives, goals, purpose really mattered to those involved. They cared about it. It was compelling to them. It was motivating. And they wanted to keep working on it. So they stuck with it. And finally, those that were sustained had a ready communication structure in place that fostered sustained interaction. These are bricks. For example, they had a coordinator, a point person, somebody in charge of the process who tended to it, who called periodically and checked in with the partners, who was always available to answer questions or help a partner with a particular need. They also had regularly scheduled meetings. Those who said, okay, we finished this task, we'll meet again if the need arises, tended not to ever meet again. So regularly scheduled meetings were a critical structure. The sustained processes also had other scheduled activities or obligations embedded in their process that ensured that their paths would regularly interact. And these were things like site visits and field trips and monitoring sessions and public events and conferences and the like that kept them interacting. So these are factors to keep in mind as you try to sustain your collaborative partnerships. And I'll stop there, and in the Q&A session, we can talk about some ways to accomplish these things. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. And next up, we're going to hear from Kristen Goodrich, who is the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at the Tijuana River National Estuarine Research Reserve. Kristen is both a researcher and a practitioner of collaborative research. And the context that she comes from is interesting, not only in terms of the work that she's done in engaging a really diverse group of stakeholders in Southern California, but also dealing with impositions that come and barriers to collaboration that come when trying to work on a transboundary basis across the US-Mexico border, which have enforced social distancing restrictions of a type for many years, not just recently. So I'll hand it over to Kristen.
Thank you so much, James. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We have busy schedules, and we just really appreciate you spending the time with us and look forward to dialogue. As James mentioned, I'm the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at the Tijuana River Reserve. And for those of you who are not part of the Science Collaborative or are external to the reserve system or partners of the reserve system, a little bit about Coastal Training Program. Our role is, as coordinators, is to really span the boundary between science and policy and decision making. And we do that through training and technical assistance. And so really this idea of collaboration and bringing people to the table is our bread and butter. And in recent times, of course, we've been challenged, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the rising to that challenge that I've observed within our amazing Coastal Training Program community and among partners that we work with. So I'll start by just acknowledging that this pandemic has really brought upon rapid change, and for some of us, transformative change. And with that, I think it's just one thing I've been observing within our community and with partners is just the amazing examples of adaptation to this situation and quick adaptation. It's been about 11 weeks for me, maybe longer for some of you or even shorter. And we've seen just incredible rapid transformation and change and adaptation, despite and acknowledging that change is very hard. We're being asked to participate in virtual meetings in ways that we never have had to before. We are being asked in many cases, Coastal Training Program coordinators are just one example of individuals who serve in collaborative lead roles, for example, in some of the NERRS Science Collaborative projects. We're being asked to facilitate virtual meetings in ways we've never been asked to before. And in addition, some of us are even being stretched to host or produce, as it's being called. I've never thought of myself as a producer, but virtual events. Large scale kind of meetings that were to be held in person previously and now are being held virtually. So just acknowledging that this is a huge change and one that has required a lot of adaptation. And some of the examples that we'll speak to, I think many of us today, just demonstrate the amazing ability of us as coastal professionals to adapt. So just some examples of the types of adaptation that I've been observing. NOAA's Office for Coastal Management has been previously providing training and technical assistance to coastal professionals. And some of us as CTP coordinators actually deliver those trainings previously in person and now virtually. But resources are just popping up. Initially, it was a quick, abrupt change. And now as we're many weeks in, we're seeing lots of different resources being brought to bear. So, for example, NOAA has developed and provided us with techniques for facilitating virtual meetings and is currently and rapidly responding to how we might be modifying training into virtual trainings that were once classroom-based or in person. Another example is the Local Government Commission putting out guidance, the Consensus Building Institute, and even different organizations focused on more of the social justice and inclusion, like the Justice Collective, thinking about equitable practices and how to run, for example, a Zoom meeting. So it's been somewhat overwhelming, I'll speak for myself, that these resources are coming out. And so what I've been trying to do myself is go back to a tried and true resource that I got from actually a collaborator with the Sacramento State Center for Collaborative Policy many years ago that I use all the time. And this is just a very simple schematic from the International Association of Public Participation that, although it's geared for public participation, it helps me kind of think about ways in which I want to set goals for meetings and why I might be setting the meeting in the first place. So just a quick snapshot, we might be thinking about informing or consulting, involving, collaborating, what this webinar is about today, or even empowering. But now on top of that, layered on top of that, we have questions about what are the best platforms virtually to be doing these types of public, or to be promoting public participation, or even just collaboration within your own organization? Do we use GoToWebinar? Do we use Zoom? Do we use Adobe Connect? And I think we'll be hearing a lot about that from our next panelist, Shannan. Another thing that this raises too is how might the NERRS Science Collaborative play a role in helping to bring some of these tools and techniques and approaches to bear as we continue to think about collaborative science and building teams and conducting our research. I put this picture up mostly because this is an image from a really amazing event and workshop that I was able to play a part in about 6 months ago now. And those of you, they now seem obsolete, but may remember those conference lanyards that you wear with your name tag. The challenges of being in this virtual space are many, but one that I've been hearing a lot about and experiencing myself are really just the challenges to kind of the organic nature of interacting with people at a conference or at a training. As coastal training program coordinators, we deliver evaluations after every training or workshop that we conduct. And very often what we see is that one of the greatest things that individuals take away from being in meeting settings is the opportunity to network, the opportunity to organically meet someone new and spark up a conversation, and maybe a project emerges. So this has been a great challenge for people to figure out, how do we overcome that, and how do we kind of think about the intrinsic value of connecting in person. You know, another challenge is just the obvious one of overcoming distance. How do we continue to think about fostering a sense of togetherness? How do we reach marginalized or traditionally underrepresented groups in some of these engagements? And how do we replicate some of the amazing things that come out of just being together in person? And while these feel like great challenges, they also offer enormous opportunity. And I think we'll be speaking a lot to that, hopefully, in the rest of our webinar and time together. I just wanted to also briefly touch on the fact that the work that we do at the Tijuana River Reserve for a long time has been transcending barriers and boundaries. A very obvious one is the U.S.-Mexico border. And I think I was just very struck by what Julia shared about the mortar, and the idea that relationships and commitment are these things that we need to be very sure that we don't lose in the process of engaging virtually, yet at the same time trying to remind ourselves that we've always been collaborating, and we will continue to collaborate now, maybe just with some new technology. So I look to the creativity that we used pre-COVID, and just am excited by the opportunity to kind of really scale that up. And finally, I'll just leave with this last slide as also an acknowledgement, and something maybe some of you are experiencing as well, of this knee-jerk reaction, at least how it's felt to me, that everything has to be done virtually. This is just an image, a snapshot of a very immediate training that we provided just after a week of our stay-at-home orders. And you can see here my dog. Many of you maybe can relate of the constant interruptions that happen when being at home, the kind of sense and feeling that while we may have had professional settings be very distant or separate from our personal lives, now folks are in our living rooms, in our bedrooms, and that this can feel uncomfortable for many individuals. Layered on top of that, I think there are challenges that are just becoming more observed. The challenge of visual challenges. Folks have been talking about, you know, just the idea that they're overwhelmed by the absence of nonverbal cues, and also even just challenges to our visual cortex. You know, this idea that our brain's central vision is really challenged by all of those Brady Bunch boxes. So I'll stop there, but just wanted to certainly acknowledge that exhaustion is becoming a very popular term, Zoom exhaustion, and that self-care is going to be really critical as we move forward into thinking about how to navigate in this space. So thank you.
Thanks, Kristen, and thanks for sharing that picture of what a in-person meeting looks like to remind us all, and also the reminder from Julia that while we probably won't return to normal like it was before, there will be a return to being together at some point, and so we can't lose sight of that possibility. Even as we're getting better at doing effective virtual meetings, which is the focus of Shannan Lewinski's work. Shannan Lewinski is an instructional designer and learning specialist with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. And in this role, she helps to design trainings, offers guidance and production support for a range of virtual meetings, webinars, workshops, and trainings, and has a really terrific command of the mechanics of virtual meetings that can really make or break an effective interaction, perhaps much more suddenly than the mechanics can make or break it in an in-person setting. So Shannan, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, James. I want to say welcome to everyone. Welcome to the webinar and welcome to my living room. Like Kristen said, we're kind of inviting everyone into our homes now, whether we want to or not. So as folks are kind of adapting their programming for this new virtual world that we find ourselves in, there's challenges and things that we need to consider as we're making these transitions. So it's not as simple as just taking maybe an in-person agenda that you once had and just executing it on a virtual platform. Today there's things that I want you guys to think about, and some techniques and tools that might aid in making that transition a little more effective, no matter what virtual platform might be available to your particular organization. Hold on a sec. Okay, so Kristen mentioned before that NOAA's Office for Coastal Management offers a range of tools that have been created for the realm of virtual meetings. So those are located on the Digital Coast under the Digital Coast Academy. I'm not going to go dive into these tools because we are going to provide links to them after this session is over. So, but we do have several job aids. There's a self-guided resource, and then we also offer an hour of technical assistance around facilitating and creating virtual meetings. So now that we're all immersed in a virtual world, I wanted to share a couple of tools that aid in kind of that group collaboration. So a few platforms that have kind of popped up are Jamboard, Mural, and excuse me, and Padlet. And these platforms are kind of whiteboards, and they offer groups the opportunity to use like Post-its, virtual Post-its, share ideas, brainstorm. So you're able to do that without having to all be together at the same time or in the same room. And currently some of these platforms are offering 30, 60, 90-day free trial. So if your organization is interested, you could go and check these out and see if they might work for your needs. But thinking about why would we use these? Well, it's a great way to gather feedback before you come into a virtual session, because when you're in a virtual session, whether it's a meeting, a training, webinar, you have a very limited amount of time together, so you need to make that time count. So thinking about, do you use a tool like this to gather feedback ahead of time to help advance your conversation, so that when you get to the virtual session, you've kind of got some data gathered and you can kind of springboard the conversation ahead. Another reason you might want to use these, you can use them live during an actual session. So if you want to do some real-time collaboration, you can use these tools right in the middle of a virtual session. And then going back to Kristen's point of Zoom exhaustion or fatigue, this is a great tool to use. Again, you can use it before or after a session, and then people can have the headspace of thinking about it on their own time and adding to this collaborative platform whenever they have the time and whenever they feel the the need to take care of it. So that way they're not feeling like, I have to be on camera, I have to be in this meeting in order to participate. So they can do it outside of an actual virtual meeting. So next, I kind of want to talk about a few best practices. So the biggest one I can say is, you don't walk into a virtual meeting, training, or webinar cold. You need to plan ahead. So establish the objective of what you want to accomplish with that session. And once you've done that, there's a virtual process agenda, which I'm happy to share this template with folks. And it has 3 columns, and the 3 columns, one is for the time, the middle is for your facilitator and your presenters to kind of put their thoughts on what they're doing. And then that right-hand column is for your producer, which Kristen brought up before. The producer is basically the person who's running behind the virtual platform. So they're kind of like the man behind the curtain. So they're making sure the polls come up, whiteboards come up, switching layout so people can screen share, and doing anything that needs to be done in the background. And then there's not always someone available to do that in everyone's organization. So you might think of having a co-facilitator who can also kind of serve in that function. So as you're thinking about designing your session, you'll have to think about in the objective, but also think about what platforms you have available to you, and then you can select the tools that you need to reach that objective. So you can use things like polls, chat boxes, breakout rooms, whiteboards, some of those other collaborative tools like Jamboard and Padlet that I mentioned before. But again, it depends on what platforms you have available to you, but no matter what platform you have available, they'll have one or all of these tools. It just depends, but you can get creative in figuring out how you actually use those tools in order to make your meeting effective and engaging. But do make sure that before you start the session and as you're planning, you have a facilitator or moderator identified ahead of time, and that their name is put into this process agenda so everybody kind of knows who's doing what and when, and then you have someone trying to help keep your meeting on time so that you don't end up running behind and you can actually reach those objectives that you're trying to get to. So the next best practice, schedule a dry run or a technology check with your presenters at a minimum. It's always a good idea to make sure with everybody working from home, different internet speeds, different equipment. We don't know what everybody has. So it's good just to, if you have a time, get all your presenters, your facilitator, get everybody online before your session and check to make sure that all the technology is in place. And if not, that allows you to kind of establish plan A or plan B for how you're going to address any issues that you have the day of the session. And we can talk more about that during Q&A. The third thing, have your facilitator, presenter, producer log in at least 20 to 30 minutes ahead of your session. Again, that's because those are the folks that are very vital to making sure that your session runs smoothly. So if you want to make sure that those people are connected, can be heard, cameras working, etc. So that way, again, they can keep that session moving forward and that there aren't delays in beginning a session. And a producer is always good to help also troubleshoot for your participants. So as long as your facilitator and presenters are ready, you can go off and running, and the producer can be in the background potentially helping with any audio issues, which hopefully there won't be any if you do your tech check. When you get everybody in, it's always good to do some sort of a welcome and orientation. So have an icebreaker on the screen if that's something that your platform will allow. And it can be a simple question like, how many virtual meetings have you facilitated? And it can be a multiple choice or short answer. So the icebreaker, again, can be based around whatever you're going to be talking about during your meeting. So it's just an initial opportunity to get some feedback from folks and to make them feel comfortable and welcome as they're kind of waiting for others to get settled in. Then this only takes 1 to 2 minutes, but go over the logistics of the platform with your participants ahead of the, right at the very beginning. So after you do your icebreaker, before you launch into your welcome and the purpose of why you're there, just go over the logistics of the platform. What tools are you using? Where do you find them? Etc. And then set the expectation for how engagement will go. So if you're going to have Q&A times, say, okay, for Q&A, we want you to raise your hand if you have a question or comment, or during the Q&A, since you're in listen only mode, we'd like you to put your questions in the chat box. So just setting expectations for how participants are to engage with the facilitators and the presenters. And then the last best practice would be to evaluate each session. So have an evaluation put together. It doesn't have to be anything super formal, but that way you're getting feedback on your session and you can see where you need to improve or ways that you could have maybe better engaged folks, and you're finding out what your group needs. So that way, again, you can plan your session maybe a little more effectively next time if there were things that didn't work. And if there are things that were worked well, by all means, do them again. But also don't forget to do a little self-evaluation. After every session, I always write down a few lessons learned, whether they are positive things or things that may have gone wrong that I'm like, hey, remember not to do that next time. So again, make sure you're evaluating both on the participant end, but also on your own end, so that, again, you can create these really great, engaging, successful, effective meetings. So back to you, James.
Thanks, Shannon. And I'll invite all the panelists to now show their videos so we can see each of them, and we'll open it for questions and answer. And Nick or Lynn, do we have questions, or I can lead off with one if we're waiting for them to come in?
We do have some questions coming in. Real
Perfect.
quick, just a couple quick comments before we start into the Q&A in earnest. We know there's a lot of expertise in the webinar today. We anticipate we probably won't have time to answer everyone's questions or even to share everyone's experiences, but we do want to just remind you to, we are looking to capture some of your ideas. So if you would please be kind enough to drop those ideas into the Gathering Ideas Google Doc that we shared earlier. It should still be posted in the chat. It's just totally open edit access, so anybody who has the link can edit it. And as we said at the outset, those ideas will be shared as we wrap up today, and also after in a summary document as well. So for the actual Q&A portion, if you have questions for our panelists, you can send them through the questions field in the GoToWebinar console. We'll be doing our best behind the scenes to organize those questions as they come in and direct them to the appropriate speakers. And as I said, we probably won't get to all of them, but we will include them in the, if you can still add questions after the session is over, and we will still add them to the summary document. You can also submit questions through the exit survey. So I'll pass it back to James here. Let's see if we have a question queued up.
Great. Yeah,
okay,
we'll take a question from the audience.
Awesome. Okay, so here's a question from the audience. I'm curious to hear how the panelists think about organizing collaborations that include people who have limited access to the platforms for collaboration, whether they are virtual or in person. How do we make sure everyone can participate fully and feel comfortable?
Julie, do you want to take that one first from kind of a long view perspective of inclusion?
Yeah, it's funny, I was going to punt it to Shannon on the technology side of things, but I think that, you know, we've talked actually about this a lot over the last 2.5 months at the university about how to ensure that all students can access classes, because, I mean, as we all know, people have different access to different technological capabilities. Some have laptops, some don't. Some are at beautiful lake houses, and others have gone home to their family's trailer. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. We have been struggling with it. Having ground rules about, you know, not sharing screens if that's possible and works with the process that you're trying to engage people in, just trying to equalize the meeting playing field, so to speak, and in many ways just being aware of, so where are disparities here, and how do we arrange this meeting in a way that doesn't elevate those disparities, that makes everyone feel welcome.
Yeah. Kristen, Shannon, from your perspectives, how have you been thinking about that aspect?
Well, from kind of the way I've been handling things, I try to look at, again, the meeting objective, and then look at the platforms available, and then thinking about, if I'm aware of it's a partner we're working with, trying to think about what platforms I know are available to them, and then thinking about, okay, if we know that we've got partners that maybe they don't have that good of bandwidth because we've been in meetings with them before, we'll try to offer, if the platform will allow, a conference call line. So if somebody gets kicked out of the platform or they don't have the bandwidth to support audio, then they can call on the phone and still be able to hear what's going on. We also send the PowerPoints for each meeting ahead of time. So again, if those things happen, people get kicked out, they still have the PowerPoint, they have a conference call line that they can join. But then you have to make sure your facilitator facilitator is aware that we do have folks on the phone, and if there's discussions going on, then that's the first thing you do is stop and say, okay, would anyone on the phone like to go ahead and comment on such and such a question? So you make sure that you acknowledge those folks first, and then get to the people on the virtual platform who might be able to raise their hand or put something in the chat box. So those are kind of some of the tools that or techniques that we've been kind of implementing so far.
Yeah, and I would just underscore what Julia and Shannan shared. I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of a phone call. That knee-jerk response I was speaking to earlier, that everything needs to be virtual. I think we need to be somewhat careful about that and recognize that in some cases, maybe the bricks, Julia, are ones that we used pre-COVID, where a phone call worked and it worked well. I think examples from the border region where I work, where internet access is very unreliable and oftentimes individuals don't have any access to, the phone had and still does work very well. There's been some interesting examples that have been coming out of discussions that we've been having in our community of practice within the coastal training program that I think underscore, Shannan, a lot of what you just brought up. Some best practices about sharing presentations in advance, turning off video for folks who have low bandwidth, some interesting ideas about creating maps for where there might be more public internet access. There's an FTC map, for example. And then I think really just having someone who, like you said, Shannan, who's assigned to be very aware of folks who are calling in by phone. There's one example, and it's an upcoming webinar that I plan to be a part of, but the North Carolina Department of Transportation just is offering a session on how they changed what they felt was a circumstance of lots of public apathy into one that is using online engagement, all of us, again, kind of pre-COVID, to revitalize planning in the state of North Carolina. And they reported that they had over 7,000% increased participation by going online, even among underrepresented groups. So I think there's a lot of room to kind of explore benefits of going online, even in areas where internet access or accessibility might be a challenge.
Well, it's a really great question, and I think that we should keep our eyes peeled for resources that are coming out from organizations that are thinking about this in particular. Kristen mentioned several on her slides. The American Geophysical Union has come up with a guide for hosting inclusive online meetings, and I think that not only are the equity issues, an element that we need to keep paying attention to, but also the technology issues on what technologies are accessible to different people. If, for example, regulations surrounding Zoom that has barred some federal employees from accessing it, that's another element that is going to keep us on our toes, shall we say. Nick, do you have another question from the participants?
We have lots of questions. So the next one here I'll ask. This one is concerned with the importance of having trusting relationships for collaboration. Any advice about how to build connections in virtually? And any tips for creating spaces and conversation focused on the mortar aspect of building trust, relationships, connections in this new context? It's probably a question for Julia to address.
Well, I'll respond to it by seconding something that Kristen just said, which is, so everything's virtual now, but old-fashioned technology about picking up the phone and reaching out to people, checking in with people. I was asked over a year ago by a coordinator of one of the science collaborative projects who was struggling with getting reasonable attendance at their meetings, and I encouraged them to pick up the phone and check in with each person individually and talk about, what are some of the issues that they're dealing with, or what are some of the questions or topics they'd really like to see on the agenda. And they reported back to me that was transformational to their group, that everybody comes to the meetings then, hopefully they're coming virtually, but just, maintaining the one-on-one relationship with people. And, you can do that by picking up the phone.
I'll share just a briefly an experience that I just recently had that maybe took a little bit of courage, in that I was invited to a virtual dinner called The Feast. And previously, these feasts were being held all around the world and occurred at dining room tables. Now they're happening virtually. And I was initially a little worried or uncomfortable about how I might be interfacing with entirely new people and strangers. And it ended up being, for me, a really a beautiful experience, and one that kind of developed or concepts that kind of came out of the meeting that I would have never expected, and even early stages of maybe a relationship and a partnership that we could be working on a project together. So I think, some of these things that are popping up, maybe for me often during the week, and it feels overwhelming and sometimes fatiguing, can be an opportunity to initiate a new relationship in ways that wouldn't have occurred previously, maybe due to distance or maybe just due to lack of opportunity. And so I think those types of interactions, though for me are challenging, also have been bearing some fruit.
Shannan, would you like to chime in?
I was just going to say that in the virtual aspect of things, I find that if we offer the different virtual tools, a lot of times, even though people may not feel like verbally saying something, like if you have an opportunity, like within Adobe Connect, having multiple chat boxes for people to give opinions on different things, I find that people are more likely to open up if they can kind of type their thoughts in without maybe having to come off mute and verbally say something. So trying to use the virtual platform to make people feel comfortable and engaged at the same time, and having webcams on if it's possible. If bandwidth's not possible, then by all means, don't do that. Use headshots. That's another way of at least being able to have people see who's who. But again, use those tools to engage people so that they feel like they're getting to know one another. And sometimes in those chat boxes, they end up forming, partnerships that they're like, oh, well, let's talk offline after this is over because I want to hear more about this project that you're working on that you just shared, or what have you. So.
Nick, do we have time for a couple more questions?
Yep, we're going to try to squeeze as many in as we can here. We have another question about mindfulness from the audience. They're wondering if there are any sort of mindfulness or other engagement activities that address the emotional aspects of participation. So, and to add a bit more context, what tools and resources can be used to establish a culture of care above all in these experiences?
Well, I have a thought.
Go ahead, Shannan.
I think we've all, within at least NOAA, we've all said to one another, and when we put together any kind of a virtual session, whether training, webinar, etc., we know it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be issues where, somebody's got a microphone and a telephone on and everything's echoing and things are going a little crazy. So just practicing patience with one another and knowing that not every session's going to go smoothly, and that we're all going to learn as we go, and we're all jumping from platform to platform, and just trying to learn all of this different technology is kind of tough. So just patience, just being patient and understanding with one another and trying to help each other,
Yeah, I love that, Shannan. And I think this time is demanding of us even more self-compassion and empathy for each other. And just some very basic techniques that I've been able to participate in or been led through on some meetings that have involved body checks, just short exercises to ground ourselves before we jump into these virtual settings. And that in some cases we're seeing is helping with some of the exhaustion. So body checks are one, deep breathing when we start our meetings, and acknowledgement of just how difficult these interactions can be, I think are some kind of basic best practices that I've at least kind of been observing during this time that have been very helpful to me, and some of our partners have expressed been helpful to them.
I will say that one of the things that the University of Michigan did that many of us appreciated is they have daily, a half hour, they have a yoga session, a meditation session. They're basically acknowledging that, people need to be we need to be thinking about people's self-care and provide the opportunities for those who are seeking it to have places to go to get it virtually. And I would just, second things that both Shannan and Kristen said. I think, being upfront at the beginning of a meeting, acknowledging, this is hard for all of us, and here are some things we can do to make it work. And some of it is be empathetic, be patient, be civil, as well as bring in those opportunities for breathing exercises or deep body checks at the beginning. That's helpful.
And one other thing I want to throw in that has become a practice is thinking about scheduling your meeting to be maybe 45 or 50 minutes instead of maybe a full hour. That way you give folks that time to transition in their head to the next meeting, or actually give them a time to stand up, walk around, or, heaven forbid, allow them to go to the restroom and get something to eat. So, so just being mindful of not trying to pack people's schedules so that they're back-to-back meetings. That way people have a time to kind of, again, get in that headspace and have a chance to breathe and get a little bit of a break.
The other idea that I piggyback on what Shannan just said is that, nowhere on the tablet was it written that all meetings must be 1 hour. If you want meetings to be worthwhile, you want them to be efficient. If there's 2 topics that you really need to talk about, let people know we're just going to do this in an hour. We'll do it, half hour, we'll do it efficiently. And that might be helpful for all of us.
And then you can think about using those virtual collaborative tools and maybe we're going to meet for 30 minutes and then you can use GoToMural or whatever and put your additional thoughts there. So you're, again, using that blended approach of FaceTime, but yet also allowing people to have headspace to go to a virtual platform on their own time and not be on the screen with others.
Yeah, I think we need to really think about, sorry, James, just quickly, the compounding stress of all of this. The stress of just work life, the stress of the topics that we all work on, and the stress of a global pandemic, and then the stress of the technology and our home lives that we're trying to manage. I just think it requires this is a very unique time that requires some real self-compassion.
A community that is now very virtual that I'm involved in is the American Geophysical Union Science to Action community. And the ground rules for that community that we reiterate at the beginning of each of our virtual meetings, I think kind of, if not a formal mindfulness activity, I think speak to some of the comments the panelists have made. And those are 4 rules. We are audacious, we are persistent and patient, we are respectful, we are inclusive. And so I think that kind of centering, of course, different collaborations may have different foundational principles, but those are ours, and I think that does help center and lead into all the mechanics that come in the meeting. Okay, Nick, let's hear another one if we can.
Sure. I think this will probably be the last one since we are real close to the top of the hour, and I want to give everyone time to respond to the question.
Okay, so speed round.
Yes, speed round. And just a reminder to everybody that we will answer some of these more technical questions in the summary document as well, which we will try to get out within the next few weeks. So last question. Any suggestions or techniques for organizing introductions in virtual workshops where it is important for participants to know who else is in attendance?
Great. Shannan, you want to take the lead on that one?
Yes. So I have found that if it's a multiple day meeting, break up the introductions and do a few each day. But if you don't have that opportunity, find a way to maybe do the introductions as people are logging in using a chat box, or again, using a short answer poll of some sort. So that way then you're not eating into the meeting time. And not that introductions are not important, but if you've got a large group, that can really take up a lot of time trying to do intros. So think about, again, using some of the technology tools to do the introductions, or break them up over a couple of days if you have that opportunity.
Great. Kristen, anything from your end?
Shannan's the pro. That's exactly what we've been trying to implement.
Yeah. And I'll add to that I've noticed that some platforms will hide the chat history if you join late. So if your introductions are, which I really have found that to be an effective way to do introductions through the chat for larger meetings, but some people may not see those introductions if the particular platform you're using hides the chat. Anything from you, Julia?
Only that's a question that I've had in my mind too, and so I'm glad somebody asked it and I could hear Shannan and Kristen respond.
So great. Well, I want to thank each of the panelists for their remarks and also all of the attendees. We reached up to over 200 during this session, and thank you for your time and interest and for your participation both through the chat but also the shared document that Nick and Lynn circulated at the beginning. I will pass it over to Nick and say good afternoon.
Great, thanks, James. I do just have a quick few points as we conclude here to think about. In the coming weeks, the Science Collaborative team will be working through your questions, as we said, and your ideas to inform our next steps. We're also producing a summary product that includes answers to the question from the Q&A session. So if you didn't get your question answered, don't worry, we'll include it in the summary document that we will send around. The document will also include ideas provided in the Gathering Ideas Google Doc and the anonymous responses to the registration questionnaire that you all filled out before you registered for the webinar. And as a quick reminder, if you later think of an idea that you wanted to share, you can also still share via the exit survey. That will automatically pop up as soon as you close the GoToWebinar window, and it'll also be sent around. There will be a link to the exit survey that gets sent out with the follow-up email that goes out tomorrow automatically. Just a quick announcement for our upcoming webinar. We have a webinar scheduled for next month on June 17th. We're excited that 3 members of the Credit for Going Green project team will be presenting in our webinar series. The team developed a way to calculate the pollutant removal rate of different buffers, which is enabling municipalities to earn regulatory credit for restoring and creating buffers. In the webinar, the team will also explain how they convened an expert panel to develop the recommendations. And with that, I'll just end with another big thank you to all of our panelists and to all of our attendees for providing their perspectives and feedback. It really is invaluable, and we love seeing all the participants that come from different sector types and different regions participate in these webinars with us. So thank you, and again, thank you to our panelists and to James for moderating. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.